And welcome to this episode of the Good Citizen Podcast. Before we jump into the content of this episode, I want to make a brief announcement. This will be the first and only episode in the month of July in 2023. We're going to experiment with a break in the month of July. First, I am traveling to a number of conferences, going to be out of the office a good bit. And then also, we've found that there are other podcasters in this space that take the month of July off due to the U.S. Supreme Court term ending in June. And then many people traveling throughout the summer months. And so we're going to experiment with that this year, and we'll be back that first week of August. So if you don't see an episode in your feed, that is the reason why. This episode, I want to accomplish two things. First, I want to do a brief review of a few U.S. Supreme Court cases or Supreme Court cases that are notable. And I want to talk about 4 facts about the 4th of July, thinking about America's past, her present, and her future. So looking forward to that. First, a few U.S. Supreme Court cases of note as the Supreme Court term came to a close at the end of June. First one is the Groff case. Groff is the postal worker, went to work at a rural post office, requested an accommodation for working on Sundays, and eventually was denied that. We went into all the details of the case. The U.S. Supreme Court case cited in his favor 9-0, amazing unanimous decision from the U.S. Supreme Court case, essentially saying that the current standard for religious accommodation in the workplace, which right now is that the employer can say, look, if your accommodation requires us to bear more than a de minimis cost, and you don't have to be a lawyer to know that's not a very high bar, then the employer can deny the religious accommodation. The Supreme Court strengthened that standard, put it back to the more robust undue hardship standard. So an employer, if they're going to deny religious accommodation, have to show that there's a significant harm to the employer. So this is directly applicable to believers all across the country, certainly to bivocational pastors that are trying to hold a ministry together while also holding down a job, and then to workers like John Kluge, who simply asked for an accommodation to not use pronouns and to just use last names of students. To other workers in the workplace that are being asked to celebrate causes and beliefs that they can't in good conscience celebrate. So heightening this religious accommodation standard is really important, and that came down 9-0, certainly something to celebrate. The next case worth noting is the 303 Creative case. I imagine many listeners are familiar with this case. I'm bringing it up because so much of the media coverage of this case simply framed it as if Lori Smith was discriminating against those in the LGBT community, that she just wouldn't serve them at all. But both parties in this case stipulated to the fact that Lori Smith would serve those in the LGBTQ community. She simply could not promote a message that was contrary to her beliefs. So it was not who was asking, it was what was the message being asked of her to convey. And she does not convey any message that's contrary to her beliefs, regardless of the person that asks. So just to clear up that fact pattern, and essentially the Supreme Court just went to bat 6-3 in this case, saying you cannot be compelled to say things that are contrary to your religious beliefs. Justice Gorsuch stated the First Amendment envisions the United States as a rich and complex place where all persons are free to think and speak as they wish, not as the government demands. Another key Supreme Court case that came down on Friday was a decision from the Indiana Supreme Court. And I know I've been talking about the U.S. Supreme Court, but since the Dobbs case last summer returned the life issue to the states, at least 20 states have moved to ban abortion. We'll link an article in the show notes that shows those states, the status of court cases, at least as of May 2023. These things are moving quickly, but that would at least give you an idea if you're interested. And on Friday, the Indiana Supreme Court upheld the state's abortion ban, found a right to privacy, upholding abortion in the case of the life of the mother, which was actually in the law passed by the legislature, but otherwise said that the General Assembly retains broad legislative discretion for determining whether and the extent to which to prohibit abortions. And of course, these state Supreme Court cases have been kind of all over the board. I was speaking at a ministry in Florida this weekend, and the Supreme Court here has the life bill in front of them, a 6-week ban in front of them. They're about to decide that. The Iowa Supreme Court deadlocked. And so we're very grateful in the state of Indiana to see a Supreme Court case upholding the law passed to defend the unborn. And just taken together, I'm just so grateful that, look, religious liberty is on a roll at the U.S. Supreme Court, and we are in a quickly changing society. We can feel cultural pressure for sure, but I am grateful that the U.S. Supreme Court has gone to bat for religious freedom, and so we can be confident in that. Let's get out and use it in making a difference in our communities. Now I want to jump into 4 facts about the 4th of July. 4 facts about the 4th of July. I'm just thinking about the 247th birthday of the United States here in 2023. I certainly feel burdened for the state of our country. I probably don't have to go into much detail there. I see so many Americans just turning against biblical principles. Many Americans just kind of shrugging their shoulders at the future of the American Republic. We see a changing order, changing world order, different geopolitics, the invasion of Ukraine, increasing tensions with China, big tech. There's just so much going on, and there are great reasons to be concerned for the American Republic. Will this republic endure into the next generation? And so there are really grievous questions, increasing division, lack of civic knowledge, all of these things that concern us about the future of the United States. So as we celebrate America's birthday, certainly there's watermelon and hot dogs and all sorts of things to celebrate these such a momentous occasion. But to do a bit deeper dive into what did July 4th mean? Why should we celebrate it? And what lessons should we draw from it as we look to the future? So 4 facts about the 4th of July. 1, that it was impossible or improbable. I'll use the word improbable. 2, it was impressive. 3, it was imperfect. And 4, it is in peril. So the first thing I'll mention is that it was improbable. It was a close call, by the way, in between the word improbable and impossible, as I will explain. But it was improbable. If you've never read the book, The Crucible of War, The 7 Years' War and the Fate of Empire in British North America, I'd encourage you to pick up a copy. I was familiar with the 7 Years' War, but I did not realize to the extent that it was the first global conflict ranging from India to America to the Caribbean to Europe, fought among the French Empire, the British Empire, Spain, Holland, all involved. And the British Empire came out on top as the world's ascendant naval power, the world's ascendant empire. And so for the Founding Fathers to gather and to sign a Declaration of Independence from Britain in the very moment that it's ascending on the world stage as essentially a superpower in its time, they said that the sun never set on the British Empire. This was quite audacious. Some might say even a bit insane, as they would have had full knowledge, many of them being familiar with military operations in North America, the strength of the British Empire, to simply say, we're going to stand on principle. We're to declare ourselves independent of Britain. We're going to sign our names, perhaps signing our death warrant if this goes badly. And they certainly could not have known that France, Netherlands, and Spain would come to her aid. They would have known something along the lines that the British Empire at the time, the British Navy had something like 250 ships, would expand to about 500 during the conflict. A standing army, again, in this time of 48,000 soldiers, would expand to about 121,000 during the conflict. And so we sit here today with great security, knowing of the American Air Force, at Navy and Army all around the world. We're so grateful for those that are standing in harm's way to protect us. And so we probably don't think much about the security of our nation from a military standpoint because of our armed forces today. Back then, the Navy's largely non-existent. They're colonies, and certainly there's an ocean that separates them from Britain, but they're facing down the might of the Royal Navy, and they could not have known that France, Netherlands, and Spain would come to her aid. They could not have known that the approximately 50,000 loyalists that formed about 70 regiments would be spurned by the British Army. And they could not have known that when they signed this, that it would signal a groundswell of support for the movement, and that approximately 400,000 Americans participated in the War for Independence in some way. And so they probably hoped these things. I'm sure they hoped that they would make this declaration, and then events would fall together and they would be successful. But they were staring down, again, the world's ascendant power. And so it was highly improbable that this thing would be successful. And the big takeaway from for me from reviewing those facts. I imagine many of our listeners are aware of some of those basic facts, but just wanted to give a reminder today, was that looking back on historical events, you're like, oh, yeah, exactly, this is how it's going to work out. And there must have been certainty in the moment when there was anything but in the moment. There's a great phrase, it's attributed to Benjamin Franklin. There's some discussion about whether it was said at all, but it certainly kind of captures the feeling of the moment in the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Supposedly he said, "We must indeed all hang together, or most assuredly, we shall all hang separately." And so it's kind of wisecrack, maybe trying to lighten up the tension in the room a bit there. But this was a bold move, an audacious move. They had no surety that this was going to be successful. They're taking on, again, Britain and her power. And that's important for us as we look at times as massive tasks, facing large groups and large interests that we're not sure how this thing is going to turn out. But certainly in the United States, there's precedent for individuals looking at huge problems, at massive tasks, and just saying, look, we're going to stand on principle. We're going to take the risk. We don't know exactly how it's going to turn out, but we're going to band together and we're going to make a difference. And so that to me is inspiring. The second one I wanted to mention is that it was impressive, that the American War for Independence, the founding of the United States, was impressive. I want to point this out because there's so much in the media. There's so much I see even on social media that points out America's flaws, and those are important notes. I'm actually going to get to some of that here in a minute, but it's important to note that this particular experiment in ordered liberty was impressive. Just to remind ourselves, yes, this is something worth celebrating. And so just a reminder is that at the time that the Declaration of Independence was signed, for most of human history, there had only been really one form of government. Certainly, there was precedent for the American Republic and the Roman Republic and also the Greek republics, though not to the same degree. But in their era, at their time, there was largely just monarchy. And many of the monarchs, or at least their lines, their families, claimed the divine right of kings beyond the Romans 13 context of saying the powers that be are ordained of God. Many of these lines claimed that, look, not only is government ordained by God, but we ourselves, like this specific line, is ordained by God. And if you come against us at all, you are not defying just us, you're defying heaven. And then it doesn't matter how we treat you. It doesn't matter if we send you into wars for our own glory. It doesn't matter if we suppress you, oppress you. We have the divine right of kings, so you can't say anything, or you're coming against God. And so this was the general form of government at the writing of the Declaration of Independence. And July 4th was impressive because the founders looked at where they were, they looked at the forms of government around them, and they decided to do something new. Certainly not unprecedented, I mentioned that already, but certainly something new in their day, in their era, to declare that they were going to form a democratic republic, that the government was going to be based on the consent of the governed. All of this was a massive experiment in their time. It was impressive. So because you're busy, I'm sure, on July 4th, this is launching on July 4th, or whenever you might be listening to it, maybe you don't have time to pull out the Declaration of Independence, but I did want to note the first two paragraphs. I'll just read them briefly here. The unanimous Declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Now, the more famous paragraph, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Before I go more deeply into that last paragraph, let me ask you this question. If you had the opportunity to form a new government, what type of government would you form? If you were in the position of the founders, you had the opportunity to form a new government, what government would you form? Looking at biblical principles, looking at the wisdom of the ages, looking at the moderate Enlightenment thinkers that many of these leaders had read, what form of government would you use? Now, I will have to, at a different time, go into the different arguments about the American War for Independence. But there were 27 reasons, specific reasons, that the founders listed in justifying the Declaration of Independence. One of them is this: he has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. And one of the reasons, and I'll kind of signal my position on this, that I don't think that the American founders were violating Romans 13, is that King George III had essentially broken the feudal bond of protection of the colonies by essentially declaring them open for invasion by other powers. He even sent Hessian troops. That's something else that is mentioned in the Declaration of Independence to put down this movement. And so the founders had something remarkable in human history. They had an opportunity to form an entirely new type of government. And they did so basing it on, and there's two major principles here. One, the fact that all men are created equal. By the way, this was not an idea dreamed up by some moderate Enlightenment philosopher. This comes straight from the Bible, that we are created equal. And so sometimes, at least at its core, the idea of America is not something, again, dreamed up by some philosopher. It is the bedrock principle that all human beings are created by God, and they're made in his image. They're worthy of equal dignity and respect. That's the foundational principle. The other principle that's interesting to think about is it talks about how, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. This is certainly a Lockean principle. But James Otis, one of the founders, also described it this way, citing back to Deuteronomy chapter number 1, and the idea being that God himself is the monarch. And of course, Israel's original form of government was a theocracy where God was king. And then in Deuteronomy 1:13, it talks about how the children of Israel were to set up leaders and judges among them, and that those leaders would then help oversee the people. And so James Otis, again, one of the signers, he says this: God is the only monarch in the universe who has a clear and indisputable right to absolute power, because he's the only one who is omniscient as well as omnipotent. The sum of my argument is that civil government is of God, that the administrators of it were originally the whole people. And so there was a sight back to kind of Israel's original form of government rather than to a monarchy. And again, they came out with this entirely novel, at least for their age, form of government. And I'll tell you, that decision has made a remarkable impact in the last 200 years of human history. The approximately 195 nations today, again, how you measure these things is in dispute, but a large number of them, one indicator up to 150 perhaps or more, have some form of democratic government. And this has so impacted the world that in Article 21 of the United Nations, 1948, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it states that the will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. So it's very easy these days to criticize the United States, to look at America. Many people say it's a failed experiment. This, of course, has been said before in times of crisis. But this was truly remarkable. When given an opportunity to form a new type of government, our founders decided to set up an experiment in ordered liberty based on the biblical truth that we were created in the image of God, and cited the authority of that government in the consent of the governed. That is worth celebrating. That was impressive. The third thing that I wanted to mention is that it was imperfect. Now, before somebody sends me an nasty email questioning my position as a patriot of the United States, look back with me, or think back with me, to the preamble of the Constitution. It says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense," etc. So even those that drafted the Constitution did not say that the United States was perfect. This is why they set out three branches of government that would push and pull against each other, because they understood human nature, that this is, the United States is a nation made up of fallible people, and so it will always be imperfect. But certainly when the statement was made that all men are created equal, the glaring omission, of course, was slavery. And so it was imperfect. And as I've come to know more individuals, as I've been around speaking in different contexts and talking to individuals in churches that are predominantly Black, that July 4th to them is very different than it was to me growing up in a more rural or suburban context. And so just listening to some of these stories, trying to hear and understand that perspective. Number three, it was imperfect. Slavery was the United States' original sin. But what do you do with that? And here's the problem, I think, and my concern for the United States going forward. There's certainly a difference between history and some of the critical race theory. We've had other episodes about critical race theory. And again, how do you define that term? My main concern is essentially splitting humans up into different groups, furthering tribalism, and it being essentially a perpetual revolution where there is no change, there is no redemption, there is no restoration. The other problem that sometimes we don't recognize America's faults in the past, and so I'm bringing this up to say it was imperfect. Not even the founders claimed that this experiment was perfect, and there certainly was a glaring omission in its claim about it being a more perfect union, about it being founded on the fact that all men are created equal. I recently completed a biography of Frederick Douglass. The book is titled The American Prophet, and such a powerful, powerful book. And of course, you may be familiar with his speech, the What to the Slave is the 4th of July. And I wanted to read a little portion of that, and stay with me to the end, because it is his conclusion that I think is so important and something that we can all learn from in this increasingly divided moment, where as the Church of Jesus Christ, we're trying to reach all people, we try to understand them, we try to understand the context of our own history, but then what do we do with that? That's the big question. What do you do with it? And so I wanted to share this with you because it's very different than what you will generally hear probably on the 4th of July this year, as far as what do you do with it. So for those of you that maybe this whole context, the fact that it was imperfect makes you uncomfortable, just stay with me. Please hear me out here. So he begins, Frederick Douglass did, what to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity. Tell us what you really think, Frederick. Your sound of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of the United States at this very hour. All right, so that's quite the speech. What a condemnation of the hypocrisy of the United States. On one hand, saying all men are created equal. We're going to fight a war for independence, but we won't free the slaves at the same time. But then it's his conclusion. And something that I was so encouraged by in the life and work of Frederick Douglass is, despite the disappointments, and you see his hope right after the Civil War. He had the relationship with Lincoln, and then he's so hopeful. And then there's the 14th Amendment, the Civil War amendments. And then the Supreme Court essentially dismantles them, and he sees the country descend back into Jim Crow, and when federal troops are pulled out of the South and former Confederates take office. But despite all of that, he remains hopeful in the American experiment. So here's what he says in the conclusion of the speech. He says, allow me to say in conclusion, notwithstanding the dark picture I have presented this day of the state of the nation, I do not despair of this country. There are forces in operation which must inevitably work the downfall of slavery. The arm of the Lord is not shortened, and the doom of slavery is certain. I therefore leave off where I began, with hope, while drawing encouragement from the Declaration of Independence, the great principles it contains, and the genius of American institutions. My spirit is also cheered by the obvious tendencies of the age. So it was imperfect. And I think it's important as American citizens, as American Christians, that we fully understand, fully recognize our flawed history. And so there was that glaring omission in the Declaration of Independence. But taking a note from Frederick Douglass, what's the goal? Is the goal then that we just throw the whole thing out? Or do we look at the principles, the remarkable principles in the document, which we have never truly lived up to and may never truly live up to, but the principles are sound, they're remarkable, They're biblical in the sense that we are created equal, and that is something worth fighting for as we move into the future. So this idea that the American experiment is imperfect, was imperfect, is actually an encouragement for us to go out and to make it a more perfect union. The last thing I will say is that the American experiment in July 4th, the whole idea, it is in peril. Now, I don't want to produce something that is mournful here, or I think there's the conclusion that America is lost and we're going down the tubes. I don't want to come across in that way. Rather, my hope is to just say, here are a few things that I see that are threats to the American Republic. And as we look to our past, what a remarkable, audacious decision to stand up to the British Empire. What an impressive decision. Something that has changed human history over the last 2 centuries and more, to set out a new form of government, realizing also that it was imperfect at the time and that we are to work to make it a more perfect union. Here are things that we need to think about. We need to work towards, but ultimately with hope that we've overcome challenges in the past. We continue to work towards the promise of the Declaration of Independence. So I would say the first thing that I see that imperils July 4th and the American experiment moving forward, probably not a surprise since you're listening to a podcast on Christian citizenship, but the first one is a lack of religion and morality. That the founders, when they put together the American experiment, and John Adams famously saying that the American experiment was made for moral and religious people. It is incompatible. It's insufficient for those that don't hold those views. And so here are the people that put this system together, saying, look, if you don't have self-control, it's hard to have self-government. And my concern as we get further and further away from any sort of objective truth grounded in Judeo-Christian principles, which are obvious in the American founding, that was the foundation of the American Republic. It was common in the citizenry, and that is what the American founders were relying on. Hey, look, we're not going to have a king. We're going to ask everyone to, in a sense, govern themselves, to work together. But if you don't have an objective sense of truth, you don't have self-control, then it is very difficult for the experiment to continue. So that lack of basic religion and morality. Also, a lack of civic knowledge. It so concerns me sometimes, just the lack of general understanding of America's form of government. Perhaps that has been true to some degree in American history in the past, but not just a lack of civic knowledge, but also kind of a disdain of America's institutions. So maybe you don't even know much about it, but you're just weighted against it. And so that lack of civic knowledge, of a basic understanding of the classic liberalism that infused the Constitution, that basically allowed for things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion. These things are hard won. They were remarkable when passed in America's Constitution, and without vigilance, without support, they can fray, they can be destroyed. James Madison said that rights are like parchment barriers. So not like a concrete barrier, they're like parchment barriers. They can be frayed, they can be torn. Another concern, I mentioned this a little bit in number 3, an emphasis on America's failures without a dedication to her future. And so as I have conversations with individuals in the public square, and as I learned more about things that happen, and we've mentioned on the podcast before, one of the last lynchings, at least kind of public lynchings in the United States, was in Marion, Indiana. And I've been to that community, and I've seen the terrible picture. And so you come to know some of these stories that you didn't know before. It's important to understand our history. But what I don't hear is a dedication to America's future. All I hear is essentially burn down the institutions. But all right, where's redemption here? Where do we go from here? How do we work together for a better future? And so maybe that's just a phase, but I'm afraid not. And so an emphasis on our failures without a dedication to her future. So where do we go from here? And then the fourth one I might mention, what imperils the American experiment today, is a lack of vision for America's place in the world in this century. So back to the very beginning, the American founders, they wanted to set up something extraordinary. Now, they they could not have known, sitting there with 13 small colonies, what America would become today. But they believed in ideas. They believed in the American experiment, and they wanted to push that forward. They wanted to do something different than the old world. They thought they had the new world to create a different experiment. And so the question for, I think, American Christians as well, American Christian citizens, is what is all of this for? What is America's purpose? Why, in God's sovereignty, does the American country, the American people, why do we have the power, the military power, but also the cultural power around the world? How can that be used? How can that be properly stewarded in a time of great turmoil, in a time of great change, where there is a geopolitical shift in the world order? How do we promote things like equal human dignity? How do we promote things like religious freedom? How do we promote the fact that we are created in the image of God? And so I think there's a lack of vision for America's place in this world, in the world, in this century. I'm thinking about that a lot, and perhaps there's some future work, some future podcast episodes on that. I'll close today with a story that I believe I have shared before, but it was so powerful to me, visiting the tomb of Lincoln. I've read the Gettysburg Address so many times, but that simple phrase, he's talking about, and you probably remember the Gettysburg Address, but the United States, he's talking about the country, and it was dedicated to the proposition, or to the idea, that all men are created equal. And so this July 4th, I know there's going to be a lot on social media, in the news media, critiquing America's past, saying, really, there's not much to celebrate here. But as Christians that believe in the doctrine of sin, know that as humans, we are capable of magnificent things, but also monstrous things all at the same time, that there are things to celebrate here. There are remarkable things to celebrate here. And then there is much work to be done to continue to work towards a more perfect union. So these 4 facts, as I was just thinking about America's 247th birthday, I just wanted to go a little bit deeper in thinking about the day and thinking about America's birthday and thinking about her future. So first, July 4th was improbable. In fact, almost impossible. And those that signed that document were acting in a bold and courageous way, and that should inspire us in our work in the public square. Next, it was impressive. It truly was remarkable in the annals of human history. We don't want to overplay things. There also have been other things that have happened in human history that are of note, but this was truly remarkable. In the face of a growing, emerging world power, the preeminent world power in the time, they decided we're going to do something different. We're going to form a democratic republic based on the biblical principle that we're created in God's image, and on the concept that government is sourced from the consent of the governed, and that truly has changed the last 2 centuries and more of human history. It was certainly imperfect, and I think that's fair to admit. I know sometimes, again, as someone that loves the United States, it does pain me to talk about our history, but it is simply the fact. But then what do you do with it? And I so appreciate, again, Douglas's approach to this, of just saying, this was ugly. This is terrible. There was terrible hypocrisy here, but the ideas, the principles are sound. The principles are beautiful, and let's lean into them with hope. And finally, I do think July 4th, the American experiment, it is in peril. It has always been in peril from the first day, and that if there's not vigilance, if there are not people of character stepping into the public square, the experiment will fail. But those reasons that I'm concerned about, the lack of religion and morality, of civic knowledge, an emphasis on our failures without a dedication to our future, and a lack of vision for why do we have this power? God's given it to us, and we didn't do it. We weren't there when the Declaration of Independence was signed, but we are here now. And so how can we best steward that in our times? And so I was just encouraged to think about America's birthday and about where we're going from here. May we dedicate ourselves to the work of continuing these principles in the American experiment. It truly is a remarkable country that we live in, and we certainly should celebrate that and continue to work towards a more perfect union. Those are 4 facts about the 4th of July. Again, we will be taking off the rest of the month of July, but we'll be back with you in August.